All right, good afternoon, and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University. Really fortunate to be back hosting the webinar this week. Iowa Learning Farms is a partnership of the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, Iowa DNR, um, and ISU Extension and Outreach. And we're really fortunate today to have with us Dr. Elliot Anderson. He's an assistant research scientist at the University of Iowa. Elliot's worked on a lot of water quality related topics in the state of Iowa and has done some work quantifying Iowa's annual phosphorus budget, which is super important. And he's going to talk to us today about that. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Dr. Anderson at the end of his talk. And with that, Dr. Anderson, the virtual floor is all yours.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And thanks everyone for joining me this afternoon. Really appreciate the opportunity to give this presentation. As Matt mentioned, I'm a researcher with the Iowa Geological Survey, and I spend a lot of my time thinking and studying about water quality issues in Iowa. And really, anytime you do that, nutrients are always at the forefront of people's minds. And so as my title, as you can probably guess from my title today, today's presentation is going to be dealing it's going to be all about phosphorus and kind of explaining how phosphorus moves in and out of Iowa's soils through various pathways and mechanisms. And so I think most of the people that are on this webinar are probably familiar with phosphorus. It's one of the chemicals that you hear about quite a bit within the state of Iowa. And in our discussions with stakeholders around the state, we often describe Iowa as having this sort of love-hate relationship with phosphorus. And the love part comes in because phosphorus is an essential nutrient. So all plants and animals need phosphorus to survive. And specifically within the state of Iowa, with our large agricultural industry, we use phosphorus quite a bit in the fertilizer that we put on our crops. Without phosphorus, we wouldn't be able to have the crop yields that we do within the state. And so that's been great because it's boosted our Iowa's economic output and it's provided food for a lot of people. But the other side to that, the hate part of this relationship, is that when phosphorus enters Iowa's water, it becomes a big pollutant of concern. And so most people have probably seen a picture similar to this somewhere in Iowa. This is a harmful algal bloom. In a lot of the surface waters that we have here in Iowa and other parts of the Midwest, phosphorus is what we call the limiting nutrient. So historically, concentrations of phosphorus in waters were very limited. We've raised that a lot in Iowa, and because of that, it's allowed for these harmful algal blooms to grow. And so those cause a lot of other issues that people are concerned about. So when you have algae, it's an ecological disruptor. It can lead to dead zones, both within the state and also in the downstream water bodies. And sometimes these algal blooms can be toxic. So the algae that are produced here can produce toxins that can harm humans or their pets. So as a little public service announcement, I always like to tell people, if you ever seen water that looks like this, avoid touching it because there could result in some adverse health impacts for you or any animals that come into contact with it. But just taking a step back briefly, really what this all arises from is over the past several centuries, humans have made large changes to the natural phosphorus cycle. So much like the water cycle, much like the nitrogen cycle, there's a phosphorus cycle in which phosphorus takes many different chemical forms and shifts throughout many different places within the waters, the earth, and environment. And what we've done is made large-scale changes to this as a species. And that's really what's resulted in some of the issues that we have today. So traditionally, what's happened is that phosphorus in previous locations, in previous times, has been very highly concentrated within mines. We've gone and extracted that phosphorus and applied it for a bunch of agricultural and industrial uses. And because of that, we've now ended up with phosphorus that's at concentrations much higher than natural, much higher than natural levels in a lot of the world's water bodies. So that's a problem because, as I mentioned before, phosphorus is a major waterborne pollutant. But with phosphorus, there's also another issue, and that it's that this element is a scarce resource. So there's only so much phosphorus that exists within these mines, within highly concentrated areas that we can use for various agricultural or industrial applications. When we take phosphorus and it gets lost, it moves through runoff and ends up in streams or lakes or rivers or oceans. That phosphorus is now in a place where we can't easily get at it. It's very diffuse. It's very, very hard to recover. And so anytime you have phosphorus that enters a water body, not only is it acting as a pollutant, but it's also a lost opportunity to use that chemical for something more productive. So I just want to shift now to the context of Iowa and talk a little bit about what a phosphorus budget is, or a nutrient budget more generally. So what we're really trying to do here is trying to quantify the amount of phosphorus that goes into and out of Iowa's landscape over a given time period. So we have several different inputs through the biogeochemical cycle. These are processes by which phosphorus makes its way into our soils. And conversely, we have several different outputs through the biogeochemical cycle. So processes by which phosphorus exits Iowa's landscape. So these are inputs and outputs, but we also have an overall amount of phosphorus storage. So this is the phosphorus that's lying around, the phosphorus that's residing within the soils as a whole. So a lot of times people talk about nutrient budgets or mass balances more generally. There's this analogy of a bank account that also comes out, that often comes up. And so you can think of the inputs as deposits in your bank account, the outputs as withdrawals, and then this phosphorus mass and storage. You can think of that as the net balance that you would have in a bank account over any given time. So, and with that little background, definitively say what we're trying to do here when we talk about a phosphorus budget in Iowa is to estimate how much phosphorus enters and exits Iowa's landscape over a predetermined time period. So what this exercise entails is really taking the well-known components of the phosphorus biogeochemical cycle and trying to assign numbers to them, trying to quantify what's going on here. And so traditionally in Iowa, based on our history, we've defined several major components that we're interested in. We have 4 inputs and 3 outputs. And I'll go through these in a little bit more detail, but the main takeaway that I want to give people just from the outset here is we have these well-known, very well-defined processes. What we're trying to do here is assign numbers to them, quantify what's going on from a phosphorus movement basis for each one of these inputs and outputs that I've got shown on my screen here. So before jumping into some of the methods and results, I always like in presentations like these to get you aware, let people know what our mindset was at the outset before we started off. So we really had these 3 definitive research questions that we wanted to answer. So the first is just how much phosphorus mass exits and enters Iowa through the various pathways of the phosphorus budget. So with this, we're trying to quantify the amount of kilograms going into and out of Iowa soil. Question number 2, we were also interested in, once we did that on an annual basis, looking at the relationships between budget components, just to see if changes in one component had any sort of influence on changes in the other components. And then finally, we wanted to estimate how much phosphorus was present within Iowa's soils overall. So again, that's the net balance of phosphorus that we're seeing within the soil. And because Iowa's very, very big. We're talking about some very, very large numbers here. The sense of scale that I want to give people for jumping into any of the results is that we need to think about these things in terms of millions of kilograms per year. So there's a lot of phosphorus moving in and out of the soils. But if you kind of use this as a benchmark, just as a reference point to compare the different budget components, this becomes very, very helpful. So most of the numbers that I've got in this presentation, we're talking about things in terms of millions of kilograms per phosphorus. So before jumping into the results, I thought people in this audience might be a little bit interested in hearing more about the specific components, and maybe even more importantly, hearing about how we can go about estimating these various types of phosphorus flux into and out of our landscape. So just quickly, I'm going to jump through each one of these and describe how we can get a back of the envelope estimate of what's going on for each one of these components that we're concerned about. So fertilizer, I've talked about this a little bit before. So phosphorus is one of the 3 major macronutrients that we have that exists in almost all fertilizer applications. So along with nitrogen and phosphorus, you see on most bags of fertilizer, you'll have these 3 numbers to telling you what percentage of that fertilizer mix corresponds to each one of these nutrients. Phosphorus is the middle one, and it'll be represented by the middle 10 here. And so within Iowa, all of the fertilizer distribution that occurs within the state is tracked pretty closely by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, or IDALS for short. You can go on your website, you can see that they have these annual fertilizer distribution reports. And so what they do is they quantify the mass of fertilizer corresponding to every mix that's been applied within the state on a given year. So let's see, we've got our three major, this is an example of one of the reports from the website. We've got the three major macronutrients here and the various mixes. So this is the percentage of the mix that exists as phosphorus in the middle column. And then we've got over here on the right the mass of that phosphorus, or the mass of that overall fertilizer that's been distributed within the state. So if you have those numbers, then really this becomes, for a lot of these components, a simple accounting problem where you're trying to compare, where you're trying to use this baseline information to come up with the mass of phosphorus that's been applied through each one of these components. So basically, you run some numbers through these, you can come up with the annual phosphorus input for any given year in Iowa. When we talk about manure, so this is the phosphorus that's produced by the livestock through their excrement that we've got in Iowa. So big livestock industry exists within the state. So we're talking about the phosphorus that exists within the manure of the various livestock that we have. And so for this, we can turn to the National Agricultural Statistics Service, or NASS for short. This is the branch of the USDA that tracks agricultural commodities throughout the country. And we can pull up values that are specific to the state of Iowa. And I've got those head counts, or those inventories, shown over here on the plot. So this is going back to 1950. So once you have the number of animals that are being reared within the state at any given time, you can do a similar sort of conversion where animal scientists and agronomists have studied the manure content of these various species and determined just how much phosphorus we see on average that's produced by each one of these different livestock commodities. So it can vary quite a bit depending on which commodity you're looking at. A lot of that is just related to animal size. So even though we have more chicken in Iowa than we have cattle, well, cattle are a lot bigger than chicken, so they tend to produce more manure overall and therefore more phosphorus. But it's another sort of accounting, sort of conversion problem where if you can get the head counts of these animals, we have pretty good estimates for what their corresponding phosphorus output is. So you multiply those together and you can get that for a statewide level. The human component is actually quite similar. So this is what's produced by the human population in Iowa through our excrement. So this is the phosphorus that's going to end up in septic tanks or wastewater treatment plants throughout the state. There's another number that people have looked at, which is the typical phosphorus output for humans. So this is a very, very straightforward calculation where we can just take the population of Iowa in any given year and apply this conversion factor and figure out how much phosphorus is being reduced or being produced from our overall population. The industry one can be a bit trickier to quantify accurately. And so that really relates to the different industrial processes that exist within any given region. Depending on what sort of industrial activity you have, the phosphorus outputs from those various properties can be quite a bit different. But when people looked at this on a continental scale, they've noticed some pretty consistent patterns. So just for example, looking at different watersheds within the Mississippi River Basin, notice that there's a general correlation between increased population sizes and increased phosphorus output. And so, as you tend to have larger population centers, you tend to have more industrial activities associated with those metropolitan areas. And we've gone in and noticed that there's a pretty strong correlation between population and phosphorus output overall. So you can actually come up with a similar sort of conversion factor that says if we have a population that's around a certain size, we have pretty general knowledge of how much phosphorus we would expect to be extracted from that population through their industrial activities. And so, well, this is a pretty straightforward calculation. You'll see at the end, just based on what's going on here in Iowa, this is a very, very minor component of the overall phosphorus budget. So it's something we can estimate simply and quickly to give us a quick sense of scale. But we're talking about overall phosphorus flux into and out of the state. This is a pretty minor player. So just jumping now to the harvest component. So this is on the output side. This is what's being extracted from the soil through the commodities, through typically the cash crops that are harvested through the typical agricultural activities that we have in the state. For this week, we can again turn back to the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And so I like this figure quite a bit because it gives a nice little snapshot for Iowa's agricultural history over the past 150 years or so. And so you can really see the large trends that we've had shifting through various crop commodities. But over the past 20 or 25 years or so, as we all know, corn and soybean have really been the dominant cash crops that have been produced in the state. You get some minor components related to hay and wheat and oats, but it's really corn and soybean that drives the harvest component here. Similarly, agronomists have looked at what's produced here in Iowa and the Midwest more broadly and come up with the typical mass that exists within each one of these various crop commodities. And so, again, this becomes another conversion problem where if you know the tons or the number of bushels of corn that's produced from Iowa at a statewide level, we can convert that pretty easily into the amount of phosphorus that's being extracted at a statewide level. So next up here is grazing. Now, grazing is actually similar to the harvest component, but instead of crops that are harvested through a combine, you could think of grazing as encapsulating the crops that are harvested through direct animal consumption. So when you have cattle that are out on pasture land consuming what's typically hay there, this is the grazing component of the phosphorus budget. And this is tracked a little bit differently. It's not quite as precise as what we'd see for the harvest component. But we can get at this by really looking at the amount of pasture land that we have within Iowa within a given year, and then looking at the standard hay yield. So that's that's an estimate of the amount of hay, the mass of hay that's produced per unit acre, so per amount of pasture land. So here on this plot over the past 25 years, I've got the pasture land shown in Iowa. And many people might be familiar with this, but we've seen a pretty marked decline in the amount of pasture land that we have in the state. So back in 1997, we had upwards of 4 million acres within pasture land. A lot of that's been converted to more traditional row crops. And so because of that, we see much less pasture land and then much less phosphorus that's consumed as a result of animals grazing. And then the last one of the 7 here is stream export. And this is actually the one that's the trickiest to calculate and quantify. But the way we go about doing this is we look at historical water quality data and historical stream flow data within Iowa's major rivers. So over here on the left-hand side, I've got a map that shows monitoring sites of Iowa's 16 major rivers. And these are the locations that are placed the most downstream along each one of these rivers, still within the state. So if you can calculate the amount of phosphorus that leaves each one of these watersheds and adds that together, that in turn is a really good estimate of the overall stream export. So this is the mass of phosphorus that's leaving Iowa through its streams each year. And we can come up with estimates from this based off of historical water quality data and then historical stream flow data. I won't go too much into the weeds of how specifically this works in this presentation, but I just want to drive home the point that this does require some more advanced statistical modeling techniques. What people have done in the past for some of these calculations is just use simple linear interpolation. And I've got an example of that shown over on the left-hand side of my screen now. So this is just an example of a study that went out and took phosphorus concentrations on every day for about 100 days in a row. And I just want to show that if you were to try to estimate what was going on here in terms of phosphorus load just using monthly grab samples, which is what we typically have here in Iowa, and just connecting the dots, you can end up with a lot of errors in that method here. What typically happens is you have high runoff-based events that can put a lot of phosphorus in the stream, and those are pretty few and far between. And if you're not capturing those within your sampling protocol, then just connecting the dots through linear interpolation tends to underestimate the amount of phosphorus that we have in these models. So we use a more advanced technique, something that's called WRTDSK, which stands for weighted regression on time, discharge, and season with Kalman filtering. It's a bit of a mouthful, but really what this is trying to do is looking at underlying relationships between phosphorus, stream flow conditions, seasonality, and temporal trends to fill in the gaps better between these monthly data sets that we have. And so that's shown here on this plot of the right, just as an example. The black dots are the historical phosphorus data that was collected in the Wapsipinicon River. And then the solid black line here are the model outputs. And so you can see it captures some of the underlying mechanisms that drive phosphorus transport much better than just a simple linear interpolation would. So you do this at each one of the 16 rivers that I'd shown on the previous slide. You add the numbers together and you can get your stream export. I did want to mention that this is kind of the limiting year in how far we can go back based on historical data. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources began widespread phosphorus monitoring in 1998. So it's much, much more difficult to use these techniques to estimate phosphorus in the streams before 1998. One other tidbit I did want to throw in here, if you run the numbers and look at what's been calculated from a point source perspective, and compare that to the overall load, we see that about over the past 25 years, 17 or so% of Iowa's statewide stream export has come from point sources. That would be things like wastewater treatment plants or industrial facilities. The remainder is coming as a non-point source, non-point source pathway. And so these are the basic results. You add all that stuff together, and I've got the 4 inputs shown over here on the left and the 3 inputs shown over here on the right. The first thing that I want to mention is that very, very, very different senses of scale when you're talking about the different components of the budget. Just look at the inputs here. We have things like manure and things like fertilizer, which are well over 100 milligrams per, or well over 100 million kilograms per year. The human and the industry component are very, very minor. You're just talking a couple of million kilograms per year. It's also a similar story when you look over at the output component. Harvest makes up the vast, vast majority of the outputs with estimates upwards of 200 million kilograms per year. Harvest and grazing and streams are much more minor. But I did want to mention, because this is an important point, that if you just look at the component that bounces up and down the most from year to year, that is the stream phosphorus component. It tends to be the most dynamic because it's largely driven by hydrologic conditions. We can break these down, a couple of these components down to a few ways that I think are pretty interesting and look at the specific commodities that make up these overall phosphorus estimates. So if we just look at the harvest component specifically, we can break this down into the major cash crops that are produced that make up this phosphorus component. And really to no one's surprise here, it's corn and soybean that dominate, that form the majority of phosphorus that's extracted via harvest in Iowa. And we've seen an increase over the past 25 years, and that's largely related to what's happened with corn. So over the past 25 years, we've seen an increase in the amount of corn that's been harvested within the state of Iowa, and so that's reflected in the phosphorus budget component as well. Similarly, if we zoom in on the manure component, so this is one of the major inputs that we've got, we can see that there's been a pretty steady increase over the past 25 years, and this is almost directly related to the increase in expansion of the hog industry in Iowa. So that's increased quite a bit over the past 25 years, and that's what makes up so hog and cattle makes up the majority of the manure component. But that increase that we're seeing in manure is largely driven by what was happening with the hogs. You can add these numbers together and do a comparison and come up with the net phosphorus budget here within a given year. So we've got this set up so for this to be inputs minus outputs, which I've got shown on the top, and then the net is the difference between the two, here shown on the bottom. Things are roughly in balance, but we do see a pattern where Iowa tends to run a phosphorus deficit in most years. So that means that the outputs tend to be a little bit higher than the inputs. When you average this up over the 25-year window that we looked at, we see that outputs tend to be 9% larger overall. But this is close enough that we usually think about these things as being roughly in balance on a statewide scale. It was a bit of a surprising result to some people that these things have stayed roughly in balance over this 25-year period, even though we've had that increase in manure. And what's really happened here is that even though manure has gone up, the harvested phosphorus that's been extracted through the corn crop has also gone up as well. And so that's largely balanced things out. You can do just a simple trend analysis on each one of these components over the past 25 years. You just see the direction that they're pointing in. So fertilizer, no definitive trend, but manure, as we mentioned before, has pretty consistently increased. Human and industry have increased because those are large, because our estimates for those are largely related to just population. So population in Iowa has gone up the past 25 years. Harvest has gone up overall. Harvest has gone up as well, largely thanks to corn. Grazing has gone down thanks to the removal of much of Iowa's pasture land, or the conversion of much of Iowa's pasture land to traditional row crop. And then there's not a definitive trend if you just look at stream phosphorus export over the past 25 years. So that's the end of research question number 1. Quickly, I want to go through research question number 2 and number 3. So with number 2, we were looking at relationships between budget components. So if you think about some of the time series that I just showed, the annual loads of phosphorus, what we're trying to do is see how those are connected with one another. And we see some interesting results, but the results in this section which require a bit of context. And so one thing that people are very, very interested in is trying to determine if stream phosphorus is correlated to any of these other components. Because when you zoom in on this particular smaller watershed or particular scale, sometimes you see that when a bunch of manure is applied within a given year, or a bunch of phosphorus is applied within a given year, that phosphorus loads tend to increase. But we don't see that at a statewide level. Things are more complicated. And the main reason behind that is because, as I mentioned before, phosphorus loads from the streams can jump up and down quite a bit from year to year. And that's largely just related to how much rainfall we see in a state. So on years that have a higher water yield, so higher overall stream flow, we tend to see much larger phosphorus loads on those years. So you get these big runoff events that occur when a lot of rainfall comes. The increased water volume that we have leaving in the state also carries with it more phosphorus. So that really is the number one thing that influences just how much phosphorus leaves Iowa within any given year. There are ways that you can look in that you can go in and try to tease out relationships between various other components, but at a statewide scale, most of that really falls apart. There's just not a clear link between what's going on in the streams and any of these other budget components that I've talked about in this presentation. There are some stronger correlations that we see over here in this correlation matrix, but a lot of times these are just indicative of what's happening very, very broadly within the state. So these are capturing these long temporal trends that I've described before. So just a couple of these as an example, and I want to focus on the manure component and its correlation to some of these other pathways that we have for phosphorus here. And so one example, just look at the relationship between manure and the human component of phosphorus. We see that they've got a really, really strong positive correlation. But this is just related to the fact that we've had a big population increase in Iowa over the past 25 years, and we've had a big expansion of the hog industry within Iowa over the past 25 years. So it's not necessarily, whenever we do this, the old adage is that correlation isn't equivalent to causation, right? And so we're seeing that here. Like, this is what's happening here. We have these two trends in Iowa, and those are what are heavily influencing the components of the phosphorus budget. It's not necessarily that one directly influences another. And we can see that again with the relationship between manure and the grazing component. So again, manure has consistently gone up, grazing has gone down, but that's generally related to economic incentives that exist within the agricultural industry here in Iowa. So there's been less of an incentive to have pasture land, more of an incentive to rear livestock. And so that's how you end up with that strong negative correlation between some of the budget components here. Again, it's not like one directly influences the other. They're just byproducts of the same larger trends that exist in a societal level here within the state. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today is we've covered the inputs and the outputs, but what about Iowa's overall soil, the phosphorus content that's stored within the soil? So this is the phosphorus that's lying around within the topsoil that we've got here in Iowa. And the way we went about estimating this was by diving into a report that was produced about 15 years ago by the Iowa Department of Natural Resource. It was called, got it shown over here on the right, it's this Trace Element Soil Sampling Project. And what they did is they went out to 530 different locations, pretty uniformly distributed throughout the state. That's what I've got shown here on the map. And within each one of these sites, they went out and tested a whole bunch of chemicals at two different depths. So they had a shallow soil horizon that they sampled, which is the first 8 inches. They had a deep soil horizon that they sampled, which was the interval from 12 to 14 inches below the surface. Tested for a whole bunch of chemicals within each one of these sites. One of those was phosphorus. So we used this existing data set to come up with an estimate for how much phosphorus existed within Iowa's soils overall. So this map that I've got shown over here on the left is the phosphorus concentration. The phosphorus concentration in the shallow data set here. And what we did was we went in and used a pretty straightforward spatial interpolation algorithm to come up with a raster that estimated phosphorus concentrations within the soil throughout the entire state. So you can do a similar thing for the density of soil. And so once we have the soil density, once we have the soil phosphorus concentration, you can multiply those together and determine the overall mass of phosphorus that we have within the state of Iowa. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that there was a very, very clear trend, no matter where we looked, that phosphorus concentrations in that top layer of soil, so 0 through 8 inches, tended to be higher than phosphorus concentrations within the bottom, or within that deep layer, so 12 to 24 inches. And this is pretty consistent with other nutrients and other carbon forms that we see when we're looking at soil profiles throughout the state. You can see how this difference manifested in the two histograms over here. And you can also get a general sense for what phosphorus concentrations were within the state when they went out and did this project. So things typically range between 500 milligrams per kilogram or parts per million to about 1,000. That's what we're sitting at. But you can have a few isolated instances where phosphorus concentrations in the soil can go much, much higher than that. So jumping into some of the final numbers here, if you look at the top 8 inches of soil that we've got in Iowa, we estimated that there were 32 billion kilograms of phosphorus there. The top 24 inches, we've got 81.5 billion kilograms. And so notice before I was talking about millions of kilograms. Here, we've just upped the game by several orders of magnitude. And in fact, the numbers that I'm discussing here are over 100 times the size of the other individual components that we have in phosphorus budgeted. So there is just a ton of phosphorus that's lying around Iowa's soils here. So this is a couple of important implications, but anytime I bring up these numbers, talk about how large phosphorus is in the soils, I always like to make the statement that a lot of this phosphorus that we're talking about that was measured in this project is not bioavailable to plants. So this is going to be phosphorus that's bounded to soil particles. And so I don't want people to get the wrong impression that, fertilizer isn't needed or doesn't do anything. Fertilizer is very helpful for boosting yields. But on top of that, we have this large legacy phosphorus component that exists within Iowa's top 2 feet of soils here. So one of the biggest takeaways from this project, because we were a little blown away just by how massive that overall number was, is that any efforts that we have to reduce phosphorus at a statewide level within our waters are really going to be contingent upon erosion control. And so keeping that large existing mass of legacy phosphorus in place. Just as a reference here, I've got this plot. And at the very bottom, I have the inputs and outputs that I showed before. And you can see those are just entirely dwarfed by what's sitting within the top 2 feet of Iowa soils. And so when we talk about the net the net flux or the inputs minus the outputs for phosphorus, those numbers are on the order of magnitude of maybe 10 million kilograms within a given year. They're so relatively small that they don't really have a meaningful impact on what exists within Iowa's soils overall. So there's always a potential here to have a whole bunch of phosphorus that ends up in our water because we have a whole bunch of soil loss or lack of erosion control. So even if we were to stop all of the manure application and fertilizer application and losses that exist during that, if we have a system that ends up hemorrhaging a bunch of soil, we're really just right back to where we started in terms of nutrient reduction goals. But there's some good news associated with this, and there has been widespread progress made within the state of Iowa when looking at how erosion concentrations or how erosion control and sediment concentrations have changed throughout time. Really in the mid-1970s with the advent of modern conservation, Iowa has made pretty substantial progress in limiting soil that's being lost to its rivers and streams. And so this has been done before, but from the context of phosphorus within the state of Iowa, because we're sitting on such a large repository, this is always going to be something that we need to keep in the back of our minds. So just some nice research answers here to wrap up with, and we'll leave you guys with. Over the past 25 years, Iowa tends to have about 240 million kilograms of phosphorus enter its soils and about 260 million kilograms exit its soils. Within the state of Iowa, within the top 2 feet of its soil, we have 81.5 billion kilograms of phosphorus, so quite a bit larger than we're seeing from the individual budget components. And then when you look at the relationships between budget components, the stream phosphorus export that we're often concerned with, that we're often talking about, is not really directly related to anything at the statewide scale. So very quickly here at the end, I want to mention that pretty much everything that I've talked about in this study or in this presentation today is contained within the study that we published about a year ago on this QR. It's open access. This QR code can link to it. You can also, if you just go into Google Scholar and search for Iowa's phosphorus budget, it should come up right away. There was an additional nutrient budget study that was published about 20 years ago or so that looked at both nitrogen and phosphorus. And so that's a nice little resource that we used as a template within our study here. Then quickly, just some acknowledgments at the end. I had several co-authors that I worked with, other people affiliated with my research institute at the University of Iowa, who were very instrumental in guiding the study and helping out. And most of the work that we did here was actually funded by the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. So very, very big thank you to them for enabling some of this work. So with that, I will leave you with this final graphical abstract, which tried to summarize everything that we put together within this study. But yeah, I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you for your attention, and I will turn things back over to Matt.
Okay. Thanks so much, Elliot. I think we do have some questions and could if you have questions, type them in. Okay, let's go to the last couple slides, logistical slides that I will take care of. If you watch this webinar live and want to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker. Her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. Email her by 5 o'clock today. Include your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, Elena Whitaker, alenaw@iastate.edu. Let's go to the next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. You can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. If you've done one for 2025, thank you very much. We just need one survey response for all 2025 webinars. So if you've done it, thanks. And if you're willing, we'd greatly appreciate it. Let's go to the next slide. So next, we're going to have Alejandro Plastina that is now at the University of Missouri Columbia, but was at Iowa State University, and he's going to talk about adoption and disadoption of conservation practices in the U.S. So what better way to get started on a 4th of July holiday end of the week, but tuning into the webinar next week for Alejandro. Okay, maybe the last one before we get to these questions. If you watch, excuse me, all our webinars are archived. You can go to the Iowa Learning Farms site, the webinars. Please encourage people that might be interested to go watch the archive of this webinar. Really struggling with my wording today, but okay, we got some questions in here. First one, I think, is quick. That one that you showed with all of the P in the state of Iowa in the soils, that was total P, not Malic 3 or anything like that. So I think you talked about that's total phosphorus, and that's why a good portion of that would not be plant available.
Yes, that's correct. And that holds true for every aspect of the budget that we're talking about today. These are all estimates of total phosphorus, so every single chemical form of phosphorus put together. That's what we were estimating for all of the parts of the budget.
Okay. There are a few questions as we think about this. The budget there, are you considering the amount of P that's recycled back to the land during grazing? And there was somebody that asked about whether they didn't see grazing as a net P removal.
So the idea behind that is captured in the manure that's produced by the animals that are doing that grazing. Okay. So even though it is a bit cyclical, both of those are captured in the budget components. So yes, we got the grazing, but then we also are keeping track of how many animals are doing the grazing and calculating the manure that's produced by those animals. So grazing animals, along with what we might think of more traditionally in the livestock industry, which are the animal feeding operations.
Okay, and I think there was a kind of a question in here about did you consider or think about the pork exports that might happen in any phosphorus that might be exported or output that way?
So we did. Again, this is something that is so the amount of phosphorus that exists within animal carcasses that cross straight lines, that's actually captured in what's being fed to the animals themselves. So that's captured in some of the livestock feed that exists within the harvest component of the budget. That is something people have asked about, and it is just tricky to find out what those export numbers are. They aren't tracked by a lot of these federal agencies on the same level because those are private transactions that exist between specific companies. So some people looked into techniques for that, and maybe that's something we'll get at the other we'll get at down the line one day. But out of all those animal carcasses that are produced, we don't know how many stay in the state. We don't know how many leave and cross state borders. So
Okay.
that's a bit tricky to look into with the
Okay.
same level of precision that we did.
Okay. Uh, Thinking about the manure and those kind of excreted, I think P2O5 values. Um, Somebody asked that, we've seen an increase in the use of phytase in feeding, which has decreased the P in manure samples. Did you account for this in the estimated P production from those animals?
It's a good question. We did not. So what we did when we were looking for those conversion factors is we tried to find factors that were as general as possible that looked at several different analyses and tried to take an estimate of those. So as you mentioned, one reason we can't really take this back too far in time is because some of those conversion factors start to break down when you go too far back in the past and you have different genetically modified crops and you have different livestock feeds and all the things that are associated with the changing agricultural industry. But in our conversion factors, we tried to come up with numbers that would be the most representative of the 25-year period that we were looking at. But to answer your question more specifically, that is a potential limitation, and that is something that people could, if you wanted to sharpen up these numbers a bit, you could bring that extra little component to the analysis.
Okay. And that would just probably kind of reduce our input slightly then, reduce that P that's in the manure fraction.
That's
Yep.
correct. So if you think we're overestimating the percentage of P that exists within the manure, it would bring that down a little
Bring
bit.
that down a little bit. Yeah. Um, okay. Uh, and this one, I think, in thinking about, I think this kind of relates also to the last one, thinking about, but how do we account for the stream bed and bank erosion, and is that also then one of those components of legacy that we need to think about?
Yeah, it's an important point. So within our numbers here, the stream export numbers that we were reporting, that is all types of erosion. So that's what's literally passing through those 16 different rivers that I've talked about.
Oh yeah.
That'll be made up of sheet and rill erosion and of bed and bank erosion. Once it gets into the river, we all treat it as the same sort of phosphorus. But other people at the survey, particular some recent projects that Keith Schilling, who has the survey, has looked at, has tried to quantify just how much phosphorus is coming from different components and just how much erosion is coming from these different components overall. I believe right now we think about a third of the state total phosphorus export is coming from stream banks. But it's an important it's an important part of the puzzle that we can't forget about when we're talking about conservation and trying to make sure erosion control is well underway here in Iowa. But for the purposes of our budget, we didn't go in and break out the different types of erosion that are contributing to the phosphorus export.
Okay. Um, it, I think this one's a good one to kind of show on a statewide basis, somewhat in balance. Did you find any specific watersheds that might be more in surplus of P?
We so we did not look at this for specific watersheds,
Okay.
just at the statewide level. And the reason behind that is some of the underlying data sets that I've talked about. You can't break that up on a watershed basis. So the biggest challenge there is actually the fertilizer one. IDALS reports that at statewide levels, we don't have the ability to go in and look at that in any at any higher capacity. You have to make some really general rough assumptions about how many crops exist within a given watershed, what's that crop makeup, and what type of fertilizer you would expect to go in there. And so when you jump into specific watersheds, your error bars get much bigger in a hurry. So we've certainly looked at stream phosphorus export within specific watersheds, but applying the same methodology to individual watersheds around the state becomes really tricky just based on the level that these data are aggregated at.
Yeah. There was somebody that asked about that WRTDSK. I think that the modeling for that graph was particulate P, and they asked was soluble P measured.
Yeah, so that's a good catch. The way we actually do it from a modeling perspective is we break up and we have separate models for the dissolved component and the particulate component. And the reason behind that is because those specific forms of phosphorus have different seasonal patterns and different relationships to stream flow. So particulate phosphorus, that's really what's being bound to those soil particles. That's what exists in the sediment. That has a much different relationship between to stream flow than the dissolved phosphorus component does. So what we actually do, and I simplified it a bit here for the sake of time, but we model the dissolved and particulate components separately and then add those together to get the total phosphorus component. But yeah, it's a good question.
Uh, there was somebody, can you maybe go back to it, but they were curious about the source of that Iowa map with the soil P at the 8 and then 8 to 12-inch level.
Um,
There
so
it is. Okay.
Yeah, so this is the project that that we used for essentially coming up with the this. So it's the trace element soil sampling project, done about 15 years ago or so. It should be, I think, relatively straightforward to find this because it was commissioned
Yeah.
by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and then with some help from the U.S. Geological Survey. And so I should just mention that. They weren't just looking at phosphorus in this project. There were about 40 or so different chemicals that they were looking at, hence the name Trace Element Soil Sampling Project. We were just interested in the phosphorus results. So you could do a similar sort of breakdown for some other components that you might be interested in within the top 2 feet of Iowa soils using this data set.
Um, there was, sorry here. Uh, Somebody asked about the models, and that WRTDSK is just a statistical model, not necessarily a physically based model for predicting loads, but a model for, I guess, utilizing measured information and interpolating between those measured dates, if that's, I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
that's correct. It is a statistical model, not a physics-based model.
Yeah.
So again, what that's trying to do, all you really need to make those run is a historical water quality data set and a historical stream flow data set that contains daily stream flow values. What the modeling framework then does is it looks for relationships between those two, and then it uses that continuous stream flow record to predict concentrations on every day within your desired time frame. So yeah, it's a statistical model that's been used many times in many different locations throughout the U.S.
I think that gets a lot of the questions that I think were asked. And so I'll do logistical things. If somebody has a last burning question, feel free to type that in there. Oh, there is a question. Uh, okay. What fraction of stream P load is reactive or dissolved reactive? And do you know anything about the uncertainty for total phosphorus given that uncertainty in dissolved P?
So at a statewide level over the past 25 years, it's about 25% is
Okay.
dissolved and 75% would be particulate there. Um, let's see. Sorry, Matt, was there a second part
Yeah,
to
there
that?
was it whether you know what the actual uncertainty for total phosphorus is given the uncertainty in dissolved P.
So we don't.
Okay.
This you can do that at an individual watershed basis. It gets a little bit tricky when you're trying to combine that sort of thing together.
Okay.
And so that's something we might be interested in looking at in the future. But I would generally say there is more uncertainty associated with the dissolved forms than the particulate forms, and it has to do with the fact that particulate phosphorus export is much more closely tied to stream flow, whereas dissolved phosphorus export is tied to some other pathways that we haven't quite delineated out.
Okay.
So generally more uncertainty associated with the dissolved component than the particulate.
Okay. All right. Okay. Logistically, if you are on today and would like to earn and want to earn your CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu and email her by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Please tune in next week for Alejandro Plastina to talk about conservation, adoption, and disadoption. Elliot, I just want to tell you thank you so very much for this presentation. I think it's super useful for us to understand, and I'd encourage folks to should be able to find their paper on this topic too, if you want to read in greater detail on any of the methods. So, Elliot, I'll leave you to any last comments.
And just thank you everyone for your attention this afternoon. There's some really great questions here. People want to follow up with me further, feel free to reach out to me via my email, just elliot-anderson at uiowa.edu.
All right. Thanks again, Elliot. Have a great day, and thanks everybody for attending.